Hello students! Today we are going to continue with higher level topic 10 and we're going to be looking at 10.3 which is speciation, and we're going to start with the first core content which is evolution. So let's get started. So the first essential understanding for evolution is that a gene pool consists of all the genes and their different alleles present in an interbreeding population. So an interbreeding population is a population of organisms of the same species that can breed with each other. So let's understand what genes are first. So our genetics is clear before we move on even further here. So if this is our DNA right here, let's remember that sections of this DNA represents a gene. So a gene can be found here, 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 everywhere, right? Small sections of DNA. Some genes can be made up of different number of base pairs. So some are longer, some are smaller. But here we have just the different genes present in that species DNA. So the alleles would be the variations of this gene. So this gene could have a variation of homozygous dominant. This gene can have a variation of both dominant and recessive, so it can have a variation of alleles, which is heterozygous. So the alleles is just the variation of the gene. And remember, there's two variations of each gene. Okay, so what is a gene pool? A gene pool represents the sum total of alleles for all genes present in a sexually reproducing population. So let's say that this is a population of, let's say that this is the DNA of a population of iguanas, right? So the iguanas have a certain number of genes in their DNA. And then all those genes that are present as they sexually reproduce, that constitutes the gene pool. So here we see a picture to represent the gene pool. So we know that if there is a large gene pool, that means there is high amounts of genetic diversity, and that means that there's a greater chance of survival for that population, or there is a greater chance of biological fitness. Which, remember, biological fitness is just the ability for that population to reproduce. So the more genetic diversity there is, the safer that population is to reproduce, because there's less chance for that population to be wiped out due to any type of environmental pressure. A small gene pool indicates a low amount of genetic diversity, reducing the biological fitness or the ability for that population to reproduce, and increases chances of extinction. So gene pools can be used to determine the allele frequency, which is the proportion of a particular allele within a population. So here we see a representation of gene pools. So you can have different genes, and for example, it could be a gene like this, or it could be a gene like this. Or you can have different genes that represent different traits or characteristics, like this, or even like this, right? Or like this. So all these are the different alleles that make up these gene pools. All right, so what is evolution then? So if you recall from last year, evolution is a cumulative change, but that cumulative change in a population requires that allele frequencies change with time. So a population cannot change, or a population cannot evolve if its allele frequencies do not change. So in order for that cumulative change of heritable characteristics in a population to happen, and therefore evolution to happen, there is a requirement. And the requirement is that the allele frequencies change within the gene pool. Okay? So there is no evolution without an allele frequency change within the gene pool. So that's important. So what's going to drive this allele frequency change? What are the mechanisms of change? So there are 5 mechanisms of change. Okay, and did I draw a hand with 5 fingers? Yeah. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 mechanisms of change. And we call them 5 key processes of change. So without these 5 key processes of change, you're not going to get a change in the allele frequency. Therefore, you won't get an evolutionary change. So let's look at them. So the first one is mutation. And remember that mutations are random. So mutations can happen randomly, and then that organism's genetic composition changes. And this happens because there is some type of base sequence change in that organism. So if these mutations happen long enough, and this random change in that organism induces change in a population, then we have a mechanism for changing allele frequency. So here you see that one of the alleles here got mutated. So therefore, there is some type of change driving the population change in that offspring. The second one is gene flow. So the movement of alleles in and out of a population as a result of immigration or emigration. So here we see that this beetle here from this population immigrated to this population right here. So now there is a gene flow or a movement of alleles, and then that's going to have an effect on this population here of green beetles as they reproduce. Another example that drives change is sexual reproduction. So we know that organisms that reproduce sexually can alter their genetic or gene combinations. Therefore, they can alter their allele frequencies. And we know that meiosis is a driving change for that. The next example is genetic drift. And we're going to study a little bit of genetic drift in upcoming videos. But the founder effect and the bottleneck effect are examples of genetic drift. So genetic drift happens due to a chance event. So something happens to a population that changes the allele frequency of that population, as you see here. And we'll study some examples of them later on. And then finally, which is the mechanism of change that Charles Darwin understood, is natural selection. And natural selection happens by some type of environmental pressure. So it might be a predator here that favors a particular organism, right? Maybe because it's not camouflaged enough. So then that particular selection pressure here from this predator drives a change in allele frequency, right? So here we see that the allele frequency of the green beetle has decreased. So I recommend you look at this TED Talk, The 5 Fingers of Evolution. So it talks a little bit about this, but it gives you a good example of how the allele frequencies need to be changed in order for evolution to happen. And the example that they use here in this TED Talk is a deck of cards. So I recommend you watching it.